sometimes the loudest strength is the one that says nothing at all. You ever been in a room full of noise, voices barking, chaos swirling, egos battling, and yet one person sitting still, silent, commands more presence than all of them combined? That's not weakness. That's not fear. That is power. There comes a point in life where you realize that not everything deserves your reaction. Not every insult deserves your explanation. And not every betrayal deserves your rage. Because silence, real, disciplined, grounded silence, is not the absence of words. It's the presence of wisdom. You see, pain will try to pull a scream out of you. Critics will try to bait a response. Betrayers will crave your breakdown. But when you choose silence, not as escape, but as control, you take the power back. You stop dancing to their noise and start moving to your own rhythm. That's when you grow. That's when you become untouchable. That's when they look at you and realize you ain't reacting because you're weak. You're silent because you've leveled up. Because when you learn to master silence, you learn to master yourself. You ever seen someone sit in a room full of chaos and not flinch, not speak, not twitch, not even blink? They're not scared, they're not lost. They've simply mastered something most people never will, the discipline of silence. While others bark, they breathe. While the room fills with ego and noise, they hold their ground in stillness. Because silence, when used right, isn't passive, it's active. It's a choice, a stance, a shield. The wise don't need to compete for the spotlight, they are the light. And when they walk into a storm, they don't yell at the wind, they just stand tall and let the noise pass. You see, the world is addicted to reaction. One insult and folks lose their minds, one disagreement and they're already shouting. But the wise, they've learned that not every battle is worth entering, not every fool deserves a lecture, and not every situation calls for noise. They conserve energy. They measure responses. And sometimes their greatest power is in saying nothing, because silence often shakes a man harder than a scream ever could. It unsettles people, makes them wonder what you're thinking. That mystery, that's the quiet strength of the wise. There's a level of maturity you reach where you stop answering questions that are designed to trigger you. You stop responding to people who twist your words just to start a fight. You stop chasing conversations that lead nowhere but frustration. That's when silence becomes your armor. Not because you're hiding, but because you've learned to choose peace over pride. That choice doesn't come easy. It's painful to stay quiet when your name is dragged through the mud. It's hard to hold your tongue when the world demands a reaction. But when you do it, when you keep your composure and walk away, it feels like freedom, like strength. Because now they don't control your emotions anymore, you do. And that's a game changer. You start to realize that arguing with ignorance is draining, that trying to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a trap. So instead you give them silence, not as a punishment, not as revenge, but as wisdom. Because silence isn't the absence of thought, it's the presence of discernment. It says, I know my worth, I don't have to explain it. And that level of control, that's a level most people never reach. The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. In fact, the one who talks the most is often the most insecure. Real power doesn't scream. Real power doesn't seek validation. It doesn't need an audience. Power stands in silence and lets its presence speak for itself. The wise have learned this through pain, through betrayal, through moments where they gave too many explanations, too many defenses, too many chances, and got burned every single time. So now they conserve their words like currency. They spend them where it matters. They no longer argue to prove a point. They walk in purpose and they let their actions speak for them. When people try to provoke them, they stay calm. Not because they're passive, but because they're powerful enough to let foolishness collapse under its own weight. When you embrace silence, you stop playing chess with people who only want to flip the board. You stop showing up to battles that rob your peace. You start walking away not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Because what they call cold or distant is really just self-respect wrapped in silence. It takes strength to speak up, but it takes greater strength to remain silent when speaking serves no purpose. Not every situation needs your voice. Not every conflict needs your correction. Silence doesn't mean you're blind. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care too much about your energy to waste it on things beneath your level. People will poke, they'll test, they'll try to pull you into the mud, and when you don't respond, they'll call you arrogant or weak or fake. Let them, because here's the truth, silence will confuse them more than any comeback ever will. When you stop reacting, they lose access to your emotions. They lose the ability to manipulate your mood. That's when you take back control. Silence allows you to observe everything and absorb nothing. It gives you space to think, to reflect, to make choices that aren't based on impulse but intention. And in that silence, you grow. You evolve. You become someone who doesn't get dragged into every fire because you've learned to be the water that puts it out, not the spark that fuels it. There is a certain kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable, not because you're doing something wrong, but because they can't read you anymore. You used to argue, you used to explain yourself, you used to fight to be understood, but now you're quiet. Now you listen more than you speak. Now you respond with your eyes, with your boundaries, with your distance. And that silence, it screams, it speaks volumes. It says, I don't need to yell to be heard. I don't need to explain why I left. I don't need to defend why I'm healing. The wise don't entertain nonsense. They don't beg to be respected. They simply remove themselves from places where their worth isn't seen. They let silence carry the weight their words once did. And the more they embrace that silence, the lighter they feel, the freer they become. Because when you no longer need to respond to every critic, every rumor, every dig, you've mastered yourself. You've tapped into something most people fear, emotional independence. And that's the kind of strength silence builds brick by brick. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. Not because you don't have anything to say, but because you finally understand the value of restraint. You realize that silence can protect your peace, preserve your dignity, and elevate your spirit. It doesn't mean you're not hurt. It doesn't mean you're not angry. It means you've matured enough to know that your response is your responsibility, and not everyone deserves access to your energy. The wise understand this. They've seen how noise can drown out clarity. They've seen how pointless arguments steal hours of your life you'll never get back. So they choose silence, not as a retreat, but as a strategy. They're not running. They're standing still in their power. They don't need the last word. They've already won when they kept their peace. They don't need to expose anyone. The truth reveals itself in time, and when the dust settles and the noise fades and the crowd stops talking, the one who remains silent will still be standing. Stronger, wiser, louder than ever, without ever saying a word. There's a difference between staying quiet because you're scared and staying quiet because you've mastered yourself. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes the strongest discipline you can ever practice. It's easy to speak when emotions are high. It's easy to lash out when anger boils. But the person who pauses, who breathes, who holds their words like they're holding fire in their hands, that person is strong. That person is in control. Because silence doesn't mean weakness. It means wisdom. The world will try to pull you out of your character. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Someone disrespects you. Someone talks behind your back. And every part of your ego wants to respond. But when you train yourself to be still, to not let their chaos pull you into reaction, that's when you start to understand your own power. That's when you realize peace is not something you chase. It's something you choose. Every time you stay silent when you could have exploded, you're strengthening your spirit. You're telling your emotions, you don't run me, I run you. And that level of control, that mastery, can't be faked. It can't be performed. It has to be earned through pain, patience, and presence. You ever notice how people who are truly at peace don't argue with everyone? They don't chase gossip. They don't need to defend their name every time it gets mentioned. They move in silence, not because they're hiding, but because they've reached a level where their energy is too expensive to waste on drama. That inner calm didn't come cheap. It was built through storms, moments where they had every reason to react, to scream, to fight, but chose stillness instead. That stillness is their fortress now, because once you've survived battles within yourself anxiety, anger, insecurity. Outside noise doesn't shake you the same. You know what real war feels like. And you know that not every loud voice is a threat. Most are just distractions. So when someone tries to pull you into their mess, when they poke at your peace, silence becomes your response. Not because you have nothing to say, but because what you could say isn't worth sacrificing what you already have, emotional balance. And once you taste that kind of calm, you protect it with everything. Because that silence took years to build. And it only takes one reaction to destroy. There's something powerful about the moment you realize you don't need to respond right away. You don't have to answer every message. You don't need to correct every false statement. That pause, that sacred breath you take between impulse and reaction, that's where your strength lives. In that small space, you find your clarity. In that space, you remind yourself that you don't owe anyone access to your peace. Emotional control is a skill, not a personality trait. You're not born with it. You build it. And building it means learning how to sit with discomfort. It means hearing things that sting and not letting them hijack your spirit. It means letting people misunderstand you, letting them judge you, and still staying grounded in who you are. Because the truth is, people will provoke you just to pull you out of alignment. They'll say things they don't even believe just to get a reaction. And when you give them silence, it throws them off. They don't know how to handle someone who doesn't play their game. That silence isn't cold, it's composed. It says, I'm not available for chaos today. And that's a whole different kind of power. It takes courage to be calm when your heart is racing. It takes maturity to be silent when you're burning inside. But the more you practice silence, the more you realize that nothing outside you deserves the power to control what's within you. That's how inner strength is formed. Not by winning every argument, but by walking away from the ones that cost you your soul. You start to understand that your reaction is someone else's reward. They push your buttons, and if you react, they win. But when you don't respond, when you keep that energy to yourself, that silence becomes your victory. It becomes the statement that says, I'm unshakable. And slowly, that discipline shapes every area of your life. You become more patient in conflict. You become more focused under pressure. You become more resilient in the face of betrayal. Because silence teaches you not just how to hold your tongue, but how to hold your peace. It teaches you that you can be hurt and still be calm. That you can be misunderstood and still be whole. That you can be triggered and still not give the trigger power. That's not suppression, that's strength. That's control. That's growth. When you begin to practice silence intentionally, you start to see what really deserves your energy and what doesn't. You stop pouring your time into fixing things that don't want to be fixed. You stop trying to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop needing validation from voices that never had your best interests at heart. That's when your silence becomes sacred. It becomes your boundary, your healing, your self-respect. You don't have to announce every move. You don't have to explain every boundary. You let silence be your line in the sand. You let it be your distance. You let it be the quiet decision that protects you from returning to places that once broke you. And the people who don't understand your silence, they were never meant to. Because silence is not about shutting people out. It's about choosing you. It's about creating space where your mind can breathe and your heart can heal. It's about choosing your own peace in a world that profits off your reaction. And the more you choose that silence, the more you reclaim your life, one quiet moment at a time. Eventually, you realize that silence is not just an act. It's a way of living. It's waking up in the morning and not reaching for your phone. It's walking away from arguments that used to pull you in. It's letting people say what they want and not letting it define your day. That silence becomes a part of your character. You're no longer triggered the same way. You're no longer drained by the same patterns. You see it all, you feel it all, but you don't let it own you. You've outgrown the need to be loud. You've outgrown the need to prove your side, because you know now the silence speaks in a language only the strong understand. It doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it doesn't defend. It simply is. And that presence, that peace, that discipline, that's your edge. That's your freedom. That's your power. Because when the world throws noise at you and you remain unmoved, it's not because you're numb. Because you've trained your soul to listen deeper, to trust more, to hold steady. And that kind of silence, that silence becomes your legacy. There comes a moment in life when words just don't work anymore. You've said it all, explained it all, cried through the pain and begged to be understood, but they still don't get it. They still don't feel the weight behind your voice. That's when silence steps in, not as surrender, but as the final truth. Because silence doesn't stutter. It doesn't beg. It doesn't try to be heard. It just is, and sometimes that silence holds more emotion than any sentence could ever carry. A quiet exit can say, I've had enough. A still gaze can scream, I'm not okay. A lack of response can whisper, you've hurt me more than you'll ever know. It's in those moments that silence becomes your protection, your expression, your message. You're not being distant. You're being clear in the only language left, presence without words. Because sometimes people don't deserve your voice anymore. They had it when it was warm, when it was loving, when it was pleading. Now they get your silence, not out of hate, but because peace became more important than being understood. And in that silence, you finally start hearing yourself again. The voice inside, the one that knows the truth no one else seems to listen to. You see, silence is not the absence of communication, it's the elevation of it. It's what happens when words fail to hold the weight of what's inside your soul. When someone breaks you, betrays you, or constantly disrespects your value, there comes a point when repeating yourself becomes exhausting. You realize that explaining your worth to someone who refuses to see it is not your job anymore. So you go quiet. You stop defending yourself. You stop trying to correct their version of you. You let the silence do the talking. Because silence is where your dignity starts. It's where your healing begins. When the tears dry up and the anger fades, silence remains. Not cold, not empty, but full. Full of lessons, full of boundaries, full of strength you didn't even know you had. You become unshakable in that silence. It becomes your voice when your heart is too tired to speak. It becomes your armor in a world that never stops asking, why are you so quiet? And the answer? You've simply learned that peace speaks softer than pain, that distance speaks clearer than arguments, and that silence, though invisible, has a volume that only the wise can hear. There's something about silence that makes people uncomfortable, because they can't read it. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know where they stand anymore. They feel your silence louder than they ever heard your voice. That's the power of it. You used to reply right away, used to write long paragraphs explaining yourself, used to fight for clarity. But now you say nothing. And that nothing, it echoes, it fills the room, it lingers. Because silence makes people face themselves. When you stop speaking, they're left alone with their own actions, their own conscience. No more arguments to distract them. No more noise to justify the damage, just silence and truth. That's why silence is feared by the guilty. It forces them to look in the mirror. It forces them to realize that what you didn't say hurts more than anything you ever said. And that pain, that realization, is the consequence they never saw coming. You didn't block them. You didn't curse them. You just disappeared into your peace. And in that peace, you found power. In that silence, you found your closure. Not because they gave it to you, but because you created it for yourself. Sometimes silence is what love sounds like when it's tired. When you've tried to fix it, tried to talk it out, tried to explain where it hurts, but nothing changes. So instead of shouting, you go quiet, not because you don't care, but because you care too much to keep bleeding in a place that won't heal you. That kind of silence is sacred. It's full of unsaid prayers, late night tears, and strength you built while no one was watching. It's always been an honor and a pleasure to be your mate. And that silence, it's not meant to punish, it's meant to protect your heart from breaking further, to protect your soul from drowning in misunderstanding. It's the final act of self-respect when love stops listening. And if they ever cared, they'll feel that silence in their chest. They'll remember the sound of your voice, your laughter, your tears, and now the silence. And it'll haunt them, not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you finally chose yourself. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away in silence. No farewell speech, no drama, just you choosing peace with tears in your eyes